Well, thank you so much, everybody. It's a real thrill to be here with you, and I draw energy from you folks. And this year, you know, I've been around politics for a long time. I've had a lot of campaigns, and for the first time this year, I feel as though I'm not standing as a member of an organization, but as a member of a movement. And you, of course, are the movement, which is why I draw energy from you. And the movement is to restore some sanity and purpose to our governance of our national affairs. And I'd like to talk a little bit about Washington, D.C. The fact of the matter is that Washington has been sick for some years now. And it has to do with the power structure, by which I mean the structure of power in Washington, D.C., which is evenly divided between the two great parties, Republican and Democrat, and they've been sharing a monopoly for some period of time. When I became a prosecutor in Massachusetts in the 1980s, the Democratic Party had been in power for 50 years. So everybody was stealing from the public trough. I made public corruption my #1 priority. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. Everybody had been being corrupt for so long, they thought it was legal. And they said, you can't indict me for that. It's commonly accepted, so it can't be criminal. It's a matter of essentially local concern if I steal money. It can't be a federal offense. Of course, they were laughed out of court. But the point of that story is that anybody who's in power for 50 years, I don't care whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats or the Libertarians, they're going to grow corrupt because they're going to be so used to the exercise of power. And it really is true, as Lord Acton, I think, said, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the poor old Republican and Democratic parties in Washington have been in power there in their duopoly for a lot more than 50 years. And they have become absolutely calcified, ossified, and corrupt, and I don't care who knows it. You see a tiny manifestation of that in the decision of the Presidential Commission on Debates this year to exclude Gary Johnson and Bill Weld, who were both two-term governors who successfully moved their states in a more conservative direction physically. We were both rated the most fiscally conservative governor in the United States during our time as governors. We were absolute trailblazers on the social side of the ledger in the direction of personal liberty. In my case, my issue where I stood out there by myself for a decade was civil rights for gays and lesbians and marriage equality, and every other politician in America shunned me when I began that at the beginning of the decade of the 90s, and I wound up appointing the woman who wrote the decision holding that marriage equality is not only a good idea, it is constitutionally compelled under both the due process and equal protection clauses. An obvious result, but one that would not have been reached if it hadn't been for the push that we gave to equal rights, civil rights for gays and lesbians. And I'm proud of that. So I hung out there for the decade of the 90s on that issue. Gary Johnson hung out there for the decade of the aughts, beginning in 1999, when he was the highest-ranking public official to come out for the legalization of marijuana. And it was just like me and gay rights. Everyone said, oh, Gary, you're on your own on that one. But he stuck with his guns, and you know, the popular opinion in the United States now is about 58-60% in favor of the legalization of marijuana for many good and sufficient reasons, one of which is that it's so much less dangerous and harmful than alcohol, which is treated totally differently, that it's irrational to say that marijuana, which doesn't kill anybody, should be unlawful. So maybe for the high, it's in competition with opioids like over-the-counter drugs, OxyContin, which give a little bit of a feeling of euphoria. But OxyContin and related pharmaceuticals kill 30,000 people a year. Marijuana doesn't kill anybody. That's a fact. When the facts change, I change my opinion. What do you do? So people are slow catching up with this, but it makes all the sense in the world. And my point here is that Gary and I don't mind being out there by ourselves. So if someone says to us, you shouldn't do what you're doing because you think we should all be libertarians and emphasize freedom and liberty and emphasize the fact that there's my favorite maxim when I was governor, there's no such thing as government money, there's only taxpayers' money. And the fact that we were both reelected with colossal margins. I got 71% of the vote in Massachusetts when I ran for reelection. At the time, Massachusetts was the second most Democratic state in the country after Rhode Island. So for us to get 71% as Republicans was quite a blow for the good guys, I thought. And I was the first of 4 Republican governors in a row, the fourth of which was Mitt Romney. So we had quite a run there because people did appreciate stewardship of fiscal and financial affairs. Same with Gary. He vetoed 750 spending bills in his 2 terms, and he had a 2-to-1 Democratic majority in the legislature, and he was overridden a grand total of 2 times out of those 750 vetoes. So both of us, we may be nice guys, we may be kind people, but we do know how to get the job done and deliver the goods at the end of the day. So we do have a plan. Our plan for Washington is to go and do the opposite of what everybody down there has been doing. And, let's be honest, the 2 political parties down there exist with almost no thought other than trying to kill each other. They really want to kill each other. The 2 campaigns at the presidential level really want to kill each other. You can't vote for anybody but me because if you do, you might be electing that guy or that woman, and we can't have that because they're not us. Well, that's an argument that assumes its own conclusion, that they're entitled to be in that position, which they're not. And the importance of what Leslie, my better half, points out, that you can change the channel, and I think the country is waking up to this little by little, but they'll wake up to it a lot more in the last 33 days here running up to the election, because the public does focus with laser-like intensity on the election as we get into the closing weeks. But the point is that nobody can deny that Gary and I instilled fiscal responsibility in our states, coming after governors who were not of our party and who were not fiscally responsible. Nobody can deny that we worked across party lines to get that done. The other candidates, frankly, don't have the executive experience in government that we have. And, they have hopes and promises, but a hope and a promise, I hate to say this because those are wonderful words, it's not really the same as a plan that you've already executed for 2 terms as the governor of a state. So there are a lot of issues out there that are tremendously, powerfully important. There's foreign policy, and I'll return to that. There are the social issues where our main goal is to play defense, and my definition of a democracy, a responsible democracy, is one where the individual shall never be thrust in a corner. And the individual can be thrust in a corner by direct government action that the Republicans would like. They're totally mean-spirited about abortion decisions, even decisions as to one's own sexuality. They want to be standing right there with you, telling you you're wrong. And if you say, well, I happen to identify as gay or lesbian, they want you to undergo conversion therapy so they can get you back on their team. I mean, it's ridiculous. And the Republicans who went to Cleveland for their convention had a hyper-movement conservative platform when they arrived, and the platform committee said, we have serious work to do. And their work was to make the platform more mean-spirited when they left Cleveland than it was when they arrived. And they were successful. They did that. So those are issues that are very important for the next administration. But having said all that, I think the most important issue is to display the political will to grapple with our financial position as a country, or we are going to spend and borrow ourselves into ruin. And I don't think that. I know that, just looking at the timelines. So what Gary and I would do is what we did as governors. And my Bible, when I took office, was a book called Laboratories of Democracy by a man named David Osborne, who was a Democrat. He was not a polemical Republican at all. But he said, if you want to get something done, what you have to do, and this became my Bible, is zero-base the budget. So you don't take last year's appropriation as your starting point. So I did this. I had a 15% deficit, 15% deficit in my budget on the day I assumed office. I had to file my first budget a month and a half later, and I closed that gap in 45 days. Everyone said it was totally impossible when I ran my campaign. They said, kid, you can't do that. You don't know anything about the state budget. I said, that's my greatest asset. And Gary Johnson and I, our first elective office in both our cases was governor. It was a huge asset. We didn't know there were any sacred cows in the budget. We didn't even know that they were cows, much less that they were sacred. So I cut entire secretariat departments out of the state budget. There was a well-named, well-meaning secretariat called the Secretariat of Consumer Affairs and Business Regulation. And what it really was a nod to all the nanny staters who wanted to regulate the small business community out of existence, because they looked at them and they said, they didn't say you're small business. They said, your business, that's really bad. Business is evil. You know, I call them the employer community, not the business community. But there are a lot of people in Massachusetts who think, and one of them was my predecessor, I'm so sorry to say, he's a good friend, but sometimes liberal Democrats do think that business is the enemy as opposed to the supplier of jobs. So I abolished that whole secretariat. I never heard a word about it. I furloughed 8,000 employees out of a workforce of 72,000 my first day in office. I never got a postcard. Where are those 8,000 indispensable employees that you furloughed? So the theme here is that you don't get to make the cuts that are necessary to bring things into balance by saying, I'm going to fight against fraud, waste, and abuse. That's what everybody says who's a freshman legislator. They don't know anything. That'll get you like 2% max on a big budget. What you have to do is eliminate programs and bureaucracies that are not necessary in the first place. And that's the libertarian way. That's why this is important. So Gary and I have proved that we have the political will to do this, and we proved that we can do it because we both did it. So we would approach the federal budget on day one, and we've sworn to introduce a balanced budget within 100 days. And in Washington, the chairman of the budget committees, Republican and Democrat, think it takes 10 years, 9 years to balance the budget. I had this conversation with them. I said, it took 4.5 years to fight World War II. What are you talking about? And they tune out. They will not hear that. And the reason they won't is because those members live with really one overpowering thought, and that's getting reelected. And it's not getting reelected to do the people's business. It's getting reelected for its own sake. And I said Washington is sick. That's sick. Okay. There's only one silver bullet for that, and that's something Gary and I will work hard at, and that's term limits for members of Congress. So we will approach the federal budget, and I won't go on forever about this, but we'll approach the budget, and everything's got to justify itself based on results, based on outcomes from the previous year. If, for example, on the upside, there's a preventive health care program that resulted in a lot of good outcomes for patients and saved a lot of expensive, unnecessary procedures and saved a lot of costs and made people healthier because prevention is an ounce of cure. Ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure in the healthcare area by definition. You get a program like that, I might, as a chief executive bent on cutting the budget, I might look at that program and say, I'm multiplying that appropriation by 20 because it's saving us money and it's producing quality outcomes for the people who are our constituents. And that's likely probably not to be a multi-zillion dollar appropriation. But the multi-zillion dollar appropriation is going to be the one that creates a vast, formless, hard-to-define bureaucracy that's lodged somewhere between the Treasury Department and the Justice Department and the Homeland Security Department and the Commerce Department. And no one can tell you quite what it does, except that it's very good about smushing things around and saying that a lot of people are working on this, i.e., it does absolutely nothing, and the people who work there are political appointees who have no reason for having a federal job. And that appropriation is going to, guess what? Zero. It doesn't matter if there are 8,000 people that work there. So I've been around government a long time. I'm not a creature of government, but I worked in the House and the Senate in Washington and as a staffer, and I was head of the criminal division of the United States Justice Department for a couple of years under Ronald Reagan. So I had a lot of international experience on terrorism and made public corruption prosecutions the #1 priority of the department, which it had never been before, because guess what? Prosecuting public corruption is rocking the boat, and Washington historically didn't like to rock the boat. But Gary and I have both been boat rockers our entire lives. Anyway, so I have a lot of experience in government. I've never seen a layer of government at any level, federal, state, local, but particularly federal, that couldn't be cut 10 or 20% without any diminution in services whatsoever. So we would approach the budget in that spirit. The one that people always throw back at us is, how can you cut the military? You're isolationist. You don't believe in the defense of the United States. That is just absolutely not anywhere near the truth. The fact is that the other two tickets are isolationists because they're anti-free trade, and we very much understand that the United States wants to maintain military supremacy in both air and naval power. I travel the world every year, both for business and because I'm a member of a group called the Interaction Council, which is a group of former world leaders. Everyone in it is a former head of state, except for me. And all the big countries have a representative, and the U.S. main representative is Bill Clinton, who's a really good participant there, but he only comes to every 5th meeting. And those folks really want to have someone to kick around and who they can ask what's really going on in Washington, because they're all riveted on the United States. So anyway, I have a lot of inputs from foreign policy in my life the last dozen years or so. And I can see that, as I mentioned earlier, the Trumpian approach to foreign policy, saying, withdraw from the WTO because China will dominate it. Well, he didn't know that we'd won every case we brought against China in the WTO. Don't go to the Trans-Pacific Partnership because China will dominate it, and I, Donald Trump, hate China. China's not a member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Which he didn't know, and he said, I guarantee you that Vladimir Putin, who's the leader I most admire, Donald Trump, most admire in the world, will never go into the Ukraine, not realizing that it had annexed Crimea 2 years earlier. So, but the most alarming of all, in my view, was his suggestion that South Korea and Japan, who have enemies close at hand, who have nuclear weapons, they should go get nuclear weapons themselves. And that, I mentioned the group of former world leaders. They meet once a year, twice a year, and discuss the great issues of the day of interest to the world. #1 issue every single year is the danger of nuclear proliferation. That's the #1 threat to the world. Interestingly, #2 is water. We don't think of it, but 80 out of the 180 countries in the United Nations, that's what their chiefs of state think about when they wake up in the morning, because they have water problems. Issue #3 is religious sectarianism, of which prime example is Sunni versus Shia, of which the sub-example is the Middle East. But these people know what they're talking about, and Donald Trump has set his face against every single recommendation that they would ever make. As a matter of fact, he set his face against every single recommendation that the Republican Party elders came up with after the 2012 election. They said we have to emphasize free trade, outreach to Latinos, outreach to women, all minority groups. Does that sound like Donald Trump? Not so much. Not so much. So, as I say, it's a year when you can really feel good about being a member of a movement that's aimed at giving the United States a sane and, yes, sober approach to public policy issues. And I'm so grateful to you all for being part of that. And you really have propelled me, you and others like you, have propelled me and Gary forward as the spear points of this movement. And our cause is eminently reasonable. And my great hope is that over the course of the next 33 days that the country will begin to focus on the race, so much so that they'll have to pay attention to all the options. And what Leslie, my bride, says, that this is the year when voters need to think for themselves, is absolutely true. And there's a huge effort underway out of Washington, poor, ossified, calcified, broken, sick Washington, to brainwash everybody into thinking it doesn't matter that the Democrats are going to spend us into the poorhouse and borrow. It doesn't matter that the Republicans have a candidate who wants to turn the clock back 200 years and who has absolutely no understanding how the economy of the country or the world works. Well, those things aren't true. And I like to think that Gary and I, as two experienced governors, by the way, we're close friends, we governed together. My second term was his first. So it's not like we were thrown together. We've known each other for 20 years. I kind of think that's a plus. And we have a wonderful time going around the country, sometimes together, sometimes apart. I do more New England, he does more Intermountain West, but often we're together, often enough for him to beat me in chess on both sides of the country. I never get introduced without hearing that story, and I guess it helps with the hat size, you know. I already have a size 8 hat, which is a big size, and there's some concern over there that I might get an 8 1/4 hat size, and then it'll be even harder to find a hat. But this year, half a year really, has been just pure joy for me, and it's ripened from pure joy into patriotic duty. And I think all of you understand that patriotic duty, or you wouldn't be here. So I'm going to ask you if you have any questions, but just in conclusion, let me say, I'm so grateful to you for affording me and Gary the platform on which we can carry this message and this movement forward. Thank you.